All right, peace. This is Damon Stith, president of HAMA, Historical African Martial Arts Association, chief instructor of Guild of the Silent Sword. And today I wanted to break some new ground, and I wanted to give a shot at doing a response video. This is my first ever attempt at doing a response video. Hopefully this is entertaining and educating at the same time. So I wanted to talk on this. There was a video that was done by Sensei Seth and Ramsey Dewey. Excuse me, Ramsey Dewey. Now both of these guys are phenomenal martial artists. They have great YouTube channels with lots of really good content, and I spend some time watching their videos and really enjoy their what they do. So shout out to those two gentlemen for opening up this topic for discussion. So they recently did a video on where Sensei Seth was asking Ramsey which traditional martial arts would blend well, would you combine with another like combat sport style fighting art to make it a little more well-rounded and more applicable for cage fighting or for combat sports. And they went through Taekwondo and a few other systems that that are usually not well represented in MMA and other combat sports. And then they got to Capoeira. Now, so we got to Capoeira, there were a few things that I really liked what were said, and there were a few things that I felt that not upset by them, but definitely needed to. I felt compelled to talk about some of the misunderstandings that we have about this art form. So here I am, and hopefully I can do that, and hopefully this again will be entertaining and hopefully shed some light on what it is that's going on with capoeira. So starting off with what I really enjoyed what was said. So, and this was the second time that this is from Ramsey. I've heard him make these correlations with capoeira. So when we look at capoeira, we see the kicks, we see the flips, we hear the music, and it throws us for a loop as to like what we're actually looking at. Like, what is this? What's going on? Like, are they dancing? Are they fighting? Like, there's a whole thing that's like going on, because you see the kicks, you see the flips, and you're not quite sure like what it is you're dealing with. So this same thing kind of happens when we talk about capoeira as a fighting art, right? So we usually focus on the kicks, and we usually focus on some of the more acrobatic aspects of the art as a way of showing like the art being used in application. So for example, if you were to use like say capoeira in a movie or in a sparring match, you really wouldn't recognize the technique unless it was something that was like, oh, that's a capoeira kick, or oh, that's a capoeira movement, like doing a cartwheel kick, or doing a spinning kick that where your head is really close to the ground. These are some hallmark techniques of capoeira, and usually what people look at when they are trying to understand it as an application art, applying the art. What we don't see with capoeira as a fighting art and just as a martial art is that although there's lots of different ways of kicking in capoeira, from the ground, standing, jumping, crouching, and really odd, awkward angles and positions, really the heart of the soul of the art, as far as like its weapons are concerned, are the headbutts and the leg sweeps, the tripping, the rasteiras. Everything that we do as capoeiristas is usually punctuates and shows and demonstrates your understanding of the game and your ability to take away your partner's space and take away their balance by using a leg sweep or something of that nature. So the heart and the soul of it is not necessarily is not the kicking per se, but it is in these leg sweeps and in the headbutting. So when Ramsey mentioned, and he made it, like I said, quite a few really nice correlations between capoeira's positions and movements and wrestling, and you can see that, and I feel that in the art by transitioning in the ginga, you're going through various positions or wrestling footwork positions and stuff. And I'm not a wrestler in the sense that I've done a lot of study of the art of wrestling, but I do have an interest in it. So that's usually when I'm telling my students to kind of give them something to understand, like how to hold their body when they ginga. I do say, like, imagine that you're transitioning, using a wrestler's stance, which makes sense again if, as an art form, if we are, the kicks and the sweeps, but the sweeps are the things that have put us on the ground. So we're looking to maintain our base and our stability. So we use our footwork and we use our rooted position to make sure that we can't be taken down. It makes a lot of sense. So I really hats off to Ramsey for making that correlation. And there's lots of other correlations that I see within the art, how it lends itself to wrestling and how it benefits you as a wrestler for a type of training and preparation for practicing the arts of grappling. Just before COVID hit, a good friend of mine and I were meeting up, and he was working through some jujitsu, and I was working on some standard, like trying to work on traditional African style wrestling, where it's more stand up and takedowns. And he spent several years training capoeira Angola, and of course I have my capoeira training as well. And what I found is that he was a really difficult opponent to take down and to get underneath and to get into positions to be able to take him down. And a lot of that I attribute to his training in capoeira, and training capoeira Angola, which favors having a lower base and having this connectedness to the ground. So I do think that there is something there, connection with capoeira and wrestling. Wrestling, as we know, as a martial art, as a combat sport, and as a tradition, is almost universally practiced across the continent. And I do believe that capoeira is a form of specialized wrestling. And so I do think that Ramsey is definitely on some really good stuff with that point. Moving on from that. That was that. And so with that being said, there were a few just kind of things that we accept as true about the art. So it's history. And I'll make this as quick as possible. So what's usually accepted as the reason why capoeira has like cartwheels, and the way that it's expressed is like you can't tell if they're dancing, playing, or fighting, is because we've accepted the idea that capoeira is a martial art disguised as a dance, so that the enslaved Africans, could practice their martial art under the guise of this dance. And that rings true with how a lot of African diasporic culture managed to survive, and how it managed to pivot and circumvent the pressures of colonialism and slavery. But the case for capoeira, that's not the truth. That's not actually the way that it went down. And this is like from my understanding and from my research. Somebody may know a lot more than me about the subject, and it may be have different points to make about it. But here are my points, and then we can all look at these things and see what's what. But from my understanding is that from the earliest mentions of capoeira in Brazil, the practices of the enslaved Africans, especially as a combat sport and a martial art, one of the earliest mentions is by Rugendis, which is a German painter, and he drew these depictions of capoeiristas and playing capoeira. And in his description, he mentioned quite plainly, that what they were doing was not like a innocent dance, but it was an aggressive fight that often turned violent, and knives were drawn, and when tempers flared. So he mentions this practice as being a very aggressive, hard practice that ultimately broke down into fights and to disorder when things got out of control. Throughout Capoeira's history in places like Rio, where police repression was, at the point of if you were practicing capoeira, you were, beaten, you were imprisoned, you were exiled. They did whatever they could to stamp out the practice of the art, and the reason why is that the culture that capoeira was a part of was not was was like a street culture in a sense, in that these were really hard times, and as a person of African descent, you had to navigate a system that was duplicitous at best, right? They gave you Christianity, but at the same time, not really keeping to these Christian tenets. You 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 had to deal with power in a very different way than, say, a an art form that was developed by like a nobility, and then it was, fought on a battlefield in that way. Now, as capoeira has roots in the battlefield and has roots in Central African styles of warfare, but its evolution in Brazil, it was dealing with having to deal with a force that was, one, stronger than you, and to deal with a force that used treachery and deceit. So therefore, you had to fight and move in a way that flowed around that, and that circumvented that through wits and through cunning, more so than physical power. Now, the physical power is part of the art, but if you notice, when you watch people play, the art's not so much about showing your power in the same way as like in a kickboxing match, when you're just trying to dominate the person however you can. That's your game. In capoeira, it is a game. It is a practice. It is a dance. It's a fight, but it's not a fight in the sense that we're talking about like a combat sport fight, or in a straight up fight, or in an MMA fight. It is an activity where we're playing with techniques and movements that are meant that can be used to hurt and to harm a person, but the aesthetic and the philosophy, and I say aesthetic again, is to not so much to KO the person. It's not to completely dominate the person. It's really, this is my opinion, it's really, we have to play this game with each other, where I'm trying to set traps for you, and I'm trying to get you to fall into these traps when we play. At the same time, you're doing the exact same thing. So as we're moving and interacting with each other, we're kind of trying to subvert each other's intentions. And we can't just do it in just any way. We have to do it in a way that shows, that conforms to these older, Central African aesthetics of beauty of movement, of play, of connection, so that we can develop this sense of like dynamic evasion, and to make the game more dynamic, because we can't develop the dynamicism that in Central Africa was required to train the warriors for the battlefield, because they used a lot of evasive movements in order to avoid being struck by weapons. So capoeira, and it's before it was capoeira, when it was Ngolo, or when it was Nsanga, or was any whatever Central African tradition that was used to develop the warriors, it was used in a way to foster and to develop the ability to slip and evade, to avoid edge and impact weapons. So following that aesthetic, the way that and this stuff is not just warfare, battlefield, dueling, when we're in there and we are playing, when we're listening to the music, when we're dancing with our fight, when we're inverting ourselves, these are not just things that are just thrown in there to throw off the slave master. These inversions are actually referencing back to Central African spirituality and cosmology that viewed the world as viewed the world as based upon a cross, and in the center of this cross was a circle, and the upper version of this circle represents our land, and the bottom version of that circle represents the land of the deceased. So anytime you see a movement that is inverted, this is a reference to that Congolese cosmology and spirituality that's being referenced. And you'll find this in a lot of African diasporic fighting arts, where there's an inversion of the head that represents kind of moving into these different worlds. So we're looking at something that's not just a match between two fighters. We're looking at a ritual space. We're looking at something that's training, but it's also kind of referencing and giving reverence to the ancestors, and there's a lot of other stuff in play. So it's not so much that these things were hidden to deceive the slave master. These things were part of the military and martial culture of the people, and we're just seeing it kind of expressed and evolved in this new context. And so when we look at it from our standpoint, we try to put it in a category to know if it's a fight, if it's a dance, if it's this, if it's that. But truly, it's existing in all these things, and then absolutely none of them. Because ultimately, when we're talking about fighting, especially in that context, is like the warriors were using this stuff to develop the skills to fight on the battlefield. Not saying that they were turning cartwheels on the battlefield, but it's documented that certain dances like the Nsanga were used as a way to train the warriors in the ability to avoid, as a defensive art, to learn how to avoid being hit by edge impact weapons and even projectile weapons. So I totally get and I totally understand that we have a hard time kind of putting capoeira in this category when we look at it. We just have to understand that and going back to it being a fighting art disguised as a dance, it's like when Brazil outlawed capoeira, they outlawed various forms of African expression. So you couldn't hide capoeira in the African dance when all those other expressions were being outlawed at the same time. And for Brazil, in the early periods, it helped for them to allow the different African groups to maintain their identity, because it kept people at odds with each other. And so then you have practices like capoeira and some of the other cultural functions that were bringing all these different groups together and finding a way to make everything kind of work together. This kind of stuff was like, not good, especially after things like the Haitian Revolution and, slave revolt, and, considering how many people of African descent are in Brazil, that kind of, then there's like these, different crackdowns on these cultural practices. But, and there's not to say that in the art of capoeira, there's not a sense of transforming your games to make them more, to make them less aggressive and less violent, and that becomes a different topic. And then we're talking about capoeira moving away from, because you have to understand that art was illegal to practice at a certain period of time. It was legal up until the 1930s. 1937, I think, is when it was actually legalized. But before that, it was illegal, and I can't remember exactly when they started to penalize the capoeiristas. But I think it was probably in the early 19th century. But as capoeira is trying to, part of the reason why, and even then when it became legal, you still had to have special permits in order to do it, and there was a stigma attached to doing capoeira. It was too closely associated with black people and associated with criminality, and it wasn't viewed in the same way that we see it today. So in order for this art to gain space, the space in order to survive, it had to tone down some of those things, some of those darker things, or some of the more martial stuff that we would expect, and move into the space of cultural expression, folklore, or in the case for regional, sport or national sport, because Brazil was heavily seeking to find a national sport, especially when lots of immigrants were coming in from Asia and from Europe. They were like, well, why not our capoeira? Brazil's capoeira, and part of the problem was that they needed to co-opt the identity of the art in order to make it again more palatable for what the Brazilian identity was. So we're getting deep. So all these pressures have affected how we see how the art it was allowed to exist and to evolve. But just know for certain that in the early 1900s and before, the capoeiristas were the people, the capoeiras, the people that were doing capoeira. They were playing the art. They were playing the art, and they were out, surviving as they do. The capoeiras, these are the people that do the art, that are part of the art, the lifestyle. They were feared. They stopped a number of they saved the city of Rio, I should say, from the uprising of the Hessian and Irish battalions that rioted in Rio. They were greatly persecuted by the police in Rio, Recife, and Bahia. Many of the early manuals on capoeira were military manuals and police manuals on the art. They were learning the art. Um, and a lot of the people, a lot of the capoeiras were sent off to wars and very, very bloody, brutal wars to fight in close quarter combat in trenches. No, they're not doing cartwheels and headstands in those trenches, but just to show you that you see one thing as play, but on the other side of that is like something that was, applicable to these situations. A number of, and kind of keying in off of Ramsey's point about capoeira and wrestling. So a number of luta livre fighters in Brazil. Luta livre is a mixed martial arts style in Brazil that was, based primarily like catch wrestling or Greco-Roman wrestling and boxing, and then some guys did some kind of kicking like Savat, and some other guys were doing like capoeira. And a number of early lucha libre fights, early pre MMA fights, pitted fighters who had a background in capoeira and lucha libre fighting with and against jiu-jitsu practitioners, and these were like in the early 1900s. So yeah, just wanted to, I know it's a mouthful. I just wanted to put that out there. This video is probably longer than what I had hoped that it would be, and hopefully I touched upon the points as best I could without having the material to be able to cite. Maybe in the future I'll do better. Hopefully this camera is still running, because I have no way of telling. I have no way of telling if I'm cut off or in frame or what. But anyways, I just wanted to do this and put this out there. Sensei Seth and Ramsey, appreciate the work that you guys are doing. Just wanted to again put that out there. Hopefully this opens up more dialogue and more understanding about what we are doing in capoeira, and hopefully maybe the three of us can sit down and have a roundtable discussion about it in the future.